What can you compare the different views of the afterlife between what the Jews and the Christians and the Islamic faith, and I think there are a few others, for instance, the Egyptian. Can you compare those?
The afterlife. Well, it took a long time for the Jews to believe in resurrection. Long time. They never believed in that until, maybe the first, second century. With the Pharisees did, but the others did not.
What did the Jews believe? What was their philosophy?
It was a slow awakening. I mean, you can see it in Scripture. You can go along and say there's no mention of this. Say you sleep in the dust forever. Are you thinking in terms of Hades or?
You during our break, you made a point. Would you like to elaborate on that a little bit?
Well, we forgot to mention that today people in Israel do not call themselves Jews. They call themselves Israelis. And that's why when you read in the papers, you don't hear about the Jews, you hear about the Israelis and the Palestinians. They both label themselves, instead of Arabs and Jews. Only the more yellow journalism will refer to Arabs and Jews. But most of your newspapers, like the Times or New York and San Francisco and papers like that, will say Israelis and Palestinians.
Right. And there are no Israelis here.
No. In America they're called Jews.
Okay, and we, before we broke, we were talking about afterlife and comparing those cultural ideas.
Well, early in the Hebrew history, the idea was that you went down into the ground, and it was cold and dark and damp, and you'd be eaten by worms and other things that happened to be under the ground. There was no mention of resurrection. Nobody ever thought, that was never mentioned. You could read through half the Old Testament and never see any mention of heaven or an afterlife or anything else. And it wasn't until the period of the captivity, when all these things were happening to them, that they began to wonder, something's wrong here. There's got to be a better life than this. Look what's happening to us. What have we done wrong? Maybe we need to look into ourselves to figure out what we're doing wrong. So through the years, this idea of going down into the ground in the cold, dark ground and sleeping forever. In fact, some of the terminology is so-and-so is asleep, and it isn't really asleep, he's dead. They'll just say he went to sleep with his ancestors. So it's a forever thing, sleeping underground. But along with the book of Daniel, there comes this new hope that maybe there's something more to life. And that's when you first hear about the Son of Man coming on the clouds of heaven to bring people to a beautiful heaven and an afterlife, and the idea of resurrection and ascending up into heaven. That whole idea starts to take root. Daniel's not spelled out, but you can see the beginnings of the ideas. And then, of course, when Jesus comes, and his idea of getting back to God, I am the way and the truth, I'm the life. And people begin to change their mind. And in between that transition period, I would say 200 BCE to 180, during that time, when Israel is back as a nation, and the guy is walking through the street to gather the excrement, and they had pipes running in front of the houses, and the guy came along with a cart, picked that all up, and took it out to the city dump, which was outside the walls of Jerusalem, and that was called Gehenna. And Gehenna is the place where everything was burned, and everything was burned. And it was putrefying and smelly and flies and maggots and all kinds of things. And gradually, this is what people came to believe hell was like, this Gehenna. And they started calling hell Gehenna. And the whole idea of going down, not down to the ground, but down to a burning pit where you burn forever. That's where that idea first started, from Gehenna. And so Gehenna came to be a euphemism for death or hell. And then, of course, in Greek, when they translated it, became Hades.
Oh. So the Greeks had the story before, but they changed the name to Hades? Or?
Well, it wasn't just the story. This was a cultural idea. It wasn't just any particular culture that had this idea. It was a gradual change from sleeping forever on the earth to suddenly going into hell and burning forever.
Mm-hmm.
Okay? So then Jesus comes along and says, no, I'm sorry, God's not like that. God is not like that at all. God is a heavenly, loving Father who loves you. He wants to take you to himself. You came from him, you're going back to him. That whole idea of completeness.
Mm-hmm.
Life is a circle, and we come from God and go back to God. That whole idea is original with Jesus. That's his concept. And of course, that gradually takes root in Christianity. And then when he dies, he was crucified on the cross, and then they experienced this resurrection. Now, what they experienced, nobody really knows, but it was the women first who came to the tomb. And that's one reason John Perry says that it's historical, because the very fact that they recorded women going to the tomb, because women were a non-entity, they were just property, collateral, you know, that they would be important enough. But because it was Jesus and the women, they recorded it. And so he says that's where the history comes in. Because they would like to say it was the disciples who were there, but they didn't. They fled. All the disciples took off. And the very fact that they recorded it, he says, you have to see that that's history, because if it hadn't been history, if they want to fictionalize it, they would have whitewashed that whole thing and said, oh, the disciples hung around and they went to the tomb and they did this. But somebody remembers that it was the women. The women are the ones that probably remember. They were the ones that went there to take care of the body and so forth. So they're the ones that discovered it was gone. So then the whole idea of resurrection takes root. And of course, this is what Paul uses in all his teachings, the whole idea of that you become a citizen of heaven. That, well, that's the derivation of that. From sleeping in the ground to heavenly Jerusalem, a better place.
It seems that the New Age era has brought back the philosophies of paganism in terms of the, not so much resurrection, but the idea of the cyclicalness of life.
Mm-hmm.
And
But see, that's what happened with the Hebrews. They were linear thinkers.
Mm-hmm.
And before that it was cyclical, but it was more agricultural cyclical.
Mm-hmm.
It was beginning harvest, December, January, February, so forth. Your seasonal thing. And so that's the way people thought at that time. Everything would repeat. But the Hebrews first came along, and their whole idea was, no, it's not that way. History is linear. There's a beginning and there's an end. And that's why they wrote their creation story. They had to have a beginning. That's another thing. The creation story added at the beginning, maybe 400 years after the rest of the Torah was written. So that's been the thrust of most of my studies, is how the scripture was put together, how the Bible was finally edited and put together. Fascinating, just fascinating to find out what books came first and what was added, what was taken away, where the scenes are, and how you can tell them apart. And you can tell what is fiction and what is history. And as they have new findings in archaeology, you can substantiate certain things and get rid of others.
so what then is the oldest book in the Bible? Which one was written first?
Probably Job.
Job.
Yeah, because it's come from the Babylonians.
And the most recent book?
Well, it would have to be John, because John wrote the last. So it'd be John, all of John's writings. They call those the Johannine scriptures. It would be the Gospel of John, the 3 letters of John, and the Book of Revelation. All by the same school. Johannine literature, it's called. So it'd have to be the Book of Revelation, because that would probably be around 100, 140, 30, something like that.
And just out of curiosity, when you were talking about Gehenna, where did Dante get his ideas for Inferno?
From the scriptures.
Yeah, except that he really created a lot of fantasy that
Oh,
we
yes.
still, in our other literature and movies and so forth, we borrowed from Dante instead of from the scripture.
Yeah,
Isn't that right?
yeah. And scripture borrowed from everybody else, so
Mhm.
it's the story of writing, is that it's,
Right.
everybody borrows from, and improves on it, or not always improves on it. But one of my pet peeves is the way they've gone through scripture and tried to make it non-exclusive as far as women are concerned. That really bothers me, because I think we need to study it the way it was written. Just like Shakespeare, what if we went back and changed all his language to today's language? Then it isn't Shakespeare anymore. It's fine to have a copy that you want someone to read and realize what it could be, but to go back and insist that this be changed and then let people think that's the way it is. I've been to many classes in scripture where people read from the Living Bible, which to me is just, it's horrible, it's terrible. It's written by one man, and he's changed everything he could into his own language. And people come and quote, well, mine is different, it says this, and I would say, yeah, but you must have the Living Bible. And they know I don't like it. It's only my opinion, but it's just, it's not right. Whereas scripture is always compiled by a large group of agreement around the world, for instance, RSB. Thousands of scholars together that agree, this is what it should say, this is what it says. But for one man to sit down and rewrite the Bible, I'm sorry, I don't buy it. He isn't going to improve on it.
Right.